He chose the wrong woman, and lost all three of them. 5 years later, 2 boys with his eyes appeared in front of him, and his perfect world shattered in an instant. Now fate wants repayment, and a second chance. Ethan Hale stood in the quiet corner of the event hall, the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses forming a muted backdrop to the moment he wished he could escape. His tie felt too tight, his suit too polished, his expression too carefully arranged. People expected perfection from him, investors, family, an entire company built on his name, and tonight he was expected to seal that image once and for all. Ashley stood beside him, flawless in her shimmering dress, a woman sculpted by society's highest expectations. Her platinum hair reflected the warm lighting of the ballroom, her sky-blue eyes smiling with the kind of composure that came from knowing she belonged to this glittering world. She was everything a Hale should marry. Everything his family wanted. Everything that made sense on paper. But the moment he whispered, "She suits my family," he felt something inside him tighten, as if the truth he was trying to bury pressed back against his ribs. He said it quietly, almost too quietly, not for Ashley, not even for the curious executives lingering nearby, but for himself. A justification disguised as certainty. A sentence meant to sound like a decision rather than a surrender. He sensed movement behind him. The softest shift of air. When he turned his head slightly, he saw Skyla standing in the doorway. Her chestnut hair fell in gentle waves over her shoulders, catching the light in a way that made her seem out of place among diamonds and tailored suits. Her eyes, those unmistakable blue eyes, looked directly at him, not with accusation or anger, but with a kind of quiet devastation. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no shouted words or broken glasses, just the stillness of something precious slipping out of reach. She understood exactly what his whisper meant. She wasn't the choice. She wasn't the one who fit. She wasn't the woman who suited his family. Ethan opened his mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to take the words back, but nothing came out. The world around him blurred as Skyla blinked hard, then stepped away from the doorway. She didn't turn quickly or dramatically, just slowly enough that he could see the hurt settling into her shoulders. And then she was gone, lost in the crowd, in the hallways, in the labyrinth of a life he had chosen without her. Ashley looped her arm through his, smiling brightly for a director approaching them. Ethan smiled back on instinct, his jaw tightening, his throat dry. The rest of the night unfolded in a haze of congratulations, strategic conversations, clinking glasses, and camera flashes. He played his part flawlessly, the perfect heir, the perfect partner, the perfect symbol of Hale industry stability. But every time he blinked, he saw Skyla's eyes. Every toast tasted bitter. Every smile felt like a lie carved too deeply into his face. Later, alone in his penthouse, he replayed the moment again and again. Her silence. His silence. The words he had spoken so softly they felt like a betrayal whispered straight into his own chest. He convinced himself he did what was right, what was expected. A life built on foundations of order and duty couldn't afford the chaos of real longing. Ashley was stability, predictability, approval. Skyla was everything he couldn't allow himself to want. And yet, as he stared at the city lights stretching endlessly beneath him, he knew that with a single whispered sentence, he had lost something irreplaceable. He wondered if she cried that night, or if she simply knew this was coming all along. He wondered if she hated him. He wondered why he hadn't followed her. Why he hadn't fought. But the truth was simple and cruel. Ethan Hale could bend markets, command rooms, shape futures. He just couldn't choose his own happiness. And as the night settled into silence, the weight of what he had done pressed down on him with the inescapable certainty that some decisions echo for years, sometimes, for a lifetime. The first year of Ethan and Ashley's marriage unfolded like a meticulously scripted performance, polished and impressive from the outside, yet hollow in the spaces where genuine warmth was supposed to live. Their wedding had been elegant, extravagant, covered by magazines and praised by shareholders who appreciated the symbolism of a stable heir. Ashley excelled at being the perfect partner in public, a woman who understood how to navigate the upper circles with effortless grace. She always smiled at the right moments, always spoke with poise, always matched the image his family expected him to uphold. And Ethan, disciplined and dutiful, matched her step for step, even when each evening felt like slipping into a life tailored for someone else. Their penthouse echoed with silence more often than conversation. Ashley enjoyed planning events, connecting with donors, curating a life that sparkled under chandeliers. Ethan admired her capability but felt strangely detached, as though he were observing someone else's story from behind a glass wall. He tried to be present, tried to let himself settle into the role of husband, but even the most luxurious dinners and the most polished gatherings couldn't erase the constant, dull ache that lived beneath every carefully chosen word. He told himself that love was a luxury for people without responsibilities. He repeated the thought until it began to sound like truth. Whenever doubts crawled in, he silenced them with work, early mornings at the office, late nights reviewing contracts, weekends taken by meetings that could have waited. Ashley rarely complained, she thrived in environments where appearances meant more than intimacy. Yet sometimes, when she watched him across the table, her smile slipped, revealing a flicker of loneliness she refused to admit even to herself. Skyla had vanished completely. She changed her number, left her apartment, and erased every trace of herself from the world that Ethan occupied. He tried not to think about her, not to remember the softness in her voice or the way she laughed as though the world wasn't heavy at all. But every day presented a reminder he didn't ask for. A passerby with her shade of hair. A song she used to hum. A pair of blue eyes in a crowd that mirrored her gaze so vividly he felt breathless for a second. He told himself it would fade. It never did. One night, nearly a year after the wedding, Ethan returned home later than usual. The penthouse was impeccably arranged, warm lights glowing against polished marble, everything in perfect order. Ashley was seated on the sofa, scrolling through her tablet, immaculate as always. She looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. He realized that she was starting to sense the cracks, the emptiness between them growing too large to ignore. She asked how his day was, he gave a practiced answer, and they shared a quiet dinner that neither of them tasted. When Ashley excused herself to make a call, Ethan wandered to the balcony, staring at the city sprawled beneath him like a glittering labyrinth. Somewhere down there, Skyla existed, but she might as well have been a dream he once had and lost upon waking. He reached for his pocket, intending to check a message, but instead his fingers brushed against a small slip of paper he had forgotten he kept, an old note in Skyla's handwriting, one she had left in his jacket long before he let her walk away. It wasn't romantic, just a simple reminder she once wrote for him during a busy week, but the curve of her letters struck him harder than any argument or accusation could have. He stood there, gripping the fading paper, feeling a mixture of frustration and longing that clawed at the edges of his composure. Inside, Ashley's voice echoed faintly through the apartment as she spoke to someone about an upcoming gala. She fit perfectly into this world, a world Ethan had been raised to inherit. And yet, he had never felt more like a stranger in his own life. Months passed, predictable and polished. Public appearances continued, and Ashley remained flawless beside him. But Ethan found himself withdrawing deeper into his work, into silence, into the unreachable parts of himself that no one could touch. He didn't allow himself to wonder where Skyla was or if she had healed. He didn't allow himself to imagine her eyes or her smile. But some nights, no matter how hard he tried to shut it out, her absence pressed against him like a memory refusing to die. He wasn't unhappy enough to leave, yet not fulfilled enough to live fully. He existed in a limbo built from ambition, duty, and the hollow comfort of routine. And beneath the polished surface of his life, something fragile was beginning to fracture. He didn't know it yet, but the consequences of the choice he had whispered a year ago were already shaping a future he could neither predict nor control. Skyla adjusted the thin blanket around the two tiny boys sleeping beside her, their chests rising and falling in uneven but determined rhythms. The dim light in the small apartment flickered softly, casting gentle shadows over their delicate features. They were not even a week old, yet each carried unmistakable pieces of Ethan, pieces she had tried so hard to forget after walking away from him on that polished, glittering night. Their hair was pale and soft, a shade too familiar, and even though their eyes were usually closed, she had already seen enough flashes of blue to know that the truth would follow them everywhere they went. She brushed her fingers across Luca's forehead, then Liam's, feeling a fierce mixture of protectiveness and fear rising inside her until it almost overwhelmed her. She had spent her pregnancy in silence, moving from city to city, working odd jobs that didn't require explanations. She lived quietly, almost invisibly, determined not to drag anyone into the storm that lived inside her. There were moments, short, unbearable moments, when she nearly reached for her phone, nearly called him, nearly typed a message asking for nothing but a voice on the other end. But each time, she remembered the look in his eyes when he whispered those quiet, final words. "She suits my family." It echoed in her mind as both a verdict and a release. Skyla knew that if she reached out, she would only step into a world where she didn't belong, a world that had already made its choice. The night she wrote the letter had been the hardest. She sat in the dim kitchen while the boys slept, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote the words she had sworn she would never say. "I had twin boys. You will never know. I'm sorry." The ink smudged where a tear fell, though she refused to admit to herself that she had been crying. When she finished, she stared at the folded paper for a long time, imagining how he might react if it somehow found its way to him. Would he be shocked? Angry? Hurt? Relieved? She didn't know, and the not knowing made the ache inside her grow sharper. She held the letter like a confession, like a piece of a life that already felt distant and unreachable. But when she walked to the mailbox, the cold night air biting her skin, she froze with the envelope in her hand. The street was quiet, the dim glow of the street lamp stretching across the pavement like a path she could follow back to the past. She stood there for nearly 10 minutes, unable to move, her heart pounding with every step she almost took. And then, very slowly, she tore the letter into pieces. The sound of the paper ripping was painfully soft, but the silence afterward felt like a verdict. She watched the pieces flutter to the ground, carried by the wind like scattered fragments of a story she could no longer afford to live in. She walked back to the apartment with empty hands, certain she had done the right thing, even though her chest felt hollow and aching. The weeks that followed were exhausting. The boys cried often, and evenings felt heavier than she could have imagined. Yet every time she looked at them, she felt something steady and unshakable forming inside her. She named them Luca and Liam because the names felt warm and strong, names that didn't carry the weight of anyone else's expectations. She whispered stories to them, promises she didn't know how to keep yet. She sang to them softly at night, her voice trembling not from fear but from the enormity of the love she felt, a love fierce enough to reshape her entire life. Still, there were nights when exhaustion dragged her down and loneliness crept back in. On those nights, she imagined an alternate world where things had gone differently, where she hadn't walked away, where he hadn't whispered those words, where their children had been born into a home filled with light instead of uncertainty. But she always shook the thought away. Dreams were dangerous. She had learned that truth the hard way. Skyla worked when she could, slept when the boys allowed it, and built a fragile, hopeful routine around the unpredictable rhythm of newborns. She was stronger than she knew, though she wouldn't have believed it if anyone told her. She lived inside a delicate balance of survival and tenderness, every day a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she had gained. And though she did not know it, could not even imagine it, the absence she left behind in Ethan's life was beginning to grow into a shadow he could no longer ignore. Somewhere far away in his world of polished surfaces and silent corridors, a feeling had started to stir. A feeling that would, one day, pull all their separate paths back into one collision neither of them could escape. 5 years later, Ethan stepped out of the sleek black car without really listening to whatever his assistant was still saying. His mind had been drifting all morning, as it often did these days, caught somewhere between restless ambition and an unnamed emptiness that followed him like a second shadow. He had been invited to speak at a charity event for community programs, something Ashley had once insisted they support together. Now he attended alone, out of habit rather than conviction, his expression composed in the way people expected from him. The cool air brushed against his face as he approached the entrance, adjusting the cuffs of his suit, preparing for another predictable afternoon of polite conversations and smiling photographs. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. In fact, he barely noticed the clusters of parents and children gathered near the entrance, distracted by his own thoughts, reviewing his speech in his mind, reminding himself of the correct tone, the correct phrases, the correct posture. But then something in the crowd shifted, a sound, a laugh, a presence, and the world around him seemed to sharpen as if someone had drawn a line through the haze of his day. He looked up, not knowing why, and his gaze locked onto a figure standing near the outdoor play area. For a moment, his breath faltered. Skyla. She was holding a box of donated supplies, the wind brushing her chestnut hair across her cheek as she tried to tuck it behind her ear. She looked older, more tired perhaps, but in a way that suggested resilience rather than defeat. There was a grounded softness to her, a quiet strength that had not existed 5 years ago. And despite everything, despite the chasm between then and now, he recognized her instantly. It felt like the echo of a memory he had tried to silence but never truly buried. But before he could move, his gaze fell on the 2 boys standing beside her, 2 boys with pale blonde hair, identical as mirror images, laughing and chasing each other through the grass. Their faces turned as they ran, and Ethan felt the ground tilt beneath him. The color of their eyes was unmistakable. That bright, clear blue he had seen in the mirror his entire life. Luca stumbled, then laughed, and Liam pulled him back up, both of them glowing with the careless joy of children who knew nothing yet of the world's complications. For several seconds, Ethan could not breathe. His heart slammed against his ribs with a force he hadn't felt in years, as if the truth were trying to break through his carefully built composure. He didn't need explanations or DNA tests or timelines. Every instinct, every atom in his body, recognized what he was seeing. Those boys carried pieces of him, his features, his expressions, something in the way they moved, the way they tilted their heads as they looked at their mother. The realization struck him like lightning. Skyla had not simply moved on with her life. She had become a mother to his children. He didn't remember taking a step, but suddenly he was closer, close enough to see Skyla freeze when she noticed him. Her fingers tightened around the donation box, her shoulders going rigid, her eyes widening with a fear she tried to disguise as politeness. The years between them collapsed into an aching, breathless silence. She looked at him as if she had seen a ghost. He felt like one. Skyla. Her name slipped out before he could stop it, quiet, unsteady, weighted with everything he had never said. The boys turned toward him, curious rather than wary. Luca's gaze examined him openly, almost analytically, while Liam hovered closer to Skyla, though he couldn't resist glancing up at Ethan again. Their presence made Ethan's pulse quicken, not from fear but from something deeper, recognition, longing, disbelief. Ashley chose that exact moment to step out of the building behind him. She had come separately, though she hadn't bothered to tell him why she was attending at all, and her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached. Her perfectly composed smile vanished the moment she saw Skyla, and then her gaze shifted to the boys. She didn't speak, but the truth illuminated her expression with cruel clarity. Ethan could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't turn. He couldn't. He stood rooted to the spot, caught between the life he had built and the life that was suddenly staring back at him in the form of 2 5-year-old boys who carried his face. Skyla set the box down slowly, her hands trembling just enough for him to notice. She opened her mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to defend herself, perhaps to run. But no words came out. She simply stood there, exposed in a way she had feared for years, knowing the moment she had tried to prevent had finally arrived. A child's laughter broke the tension. Luca tugged Liam's sleeve and whispered something, glancing curiously at Ethan again, unaware of the storm unfolding around them. The innocence in their expressions made Ethan's throat tighten so painfully that he had to swallow hard just to steady himself. He felt the world narrowing, shrinking until only 4 people existed within it: Skyla, the 2 boys, and himself. Everything else, the event, the crowd, the polished expectations of his life, faded into a dull, distant blur. Ethan couldn't decide whether the moment felt like a punishment or a miracle, only that it had changed something inside him forever. And Skyla, watching him with guarded eyes, understood that nothing would ever be the same again. Ashley stood still for several seconds, long enough for the silence between the 4 adults and the 2 boys to thicken like something tangible in the air. Her eyes moved from Skyla to the twins and then settled on Ethan with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It wasn't jealousy or anger or even betrayal. It was the sudden awareness of a truth she had quietly suspected for years but never allowed herself to confront. The realization softened her posture, as if a tension she had carried in her shoulders finally released, and for a moment she simply breathed in, slowly and deliberately, as though accepting a conclusion that had always been waiting for her. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost eerily so, lacking any edge one might expect in such a moment. "I knew," she said after a long pause, and Ethan felt the words hit him with unexpected force. She didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse him, didn't make a spectacle. "Maybe not the details, but I knew I was never the one you wanted." She looked at him not with resentment, but with an odd mixture of understanding and resignation, as though she had been waiting for this confirmation the way one waits for rain after weeks of heavy clouds. "You chose me because it was easy. Because it made sense. But you were never really mine." Ethan didn't know what to say. His throat tightened, and his mind scrambled to piece together emotions he had suppressed for so long that they no longer came in clear shapes. He glanced toward Skyla, who stood frozen, her eyes wide and anxious, clutching the edge of the donation box as if it were the last barrier between her and the chaos unfolding around her. She looked ready to apologize, ready to run with the boys before anyone could stop her, but Ashley lifted a hand gently, silently telling her there was no need for panic. Ashley turned her attention briefly to Luca and Liam. The boys watched the adults with curious but unafraid expressions, sensing tension but not understanding the weight of it. Their innocence made Ashley's gaze soften further. She stepped closer to Ethan, lowering her voice slightly. "They're yours." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an accusation. It was simply the truth spoken aloud, a truth she had already accepted. "I see it. Anyone would." Ethan felt a painful swell in his chest, not from guilt alone, but from the dawning understanding of how deeply he had failed everyone involved: Skyla, the boys, Ashley, and even himself. He opened his mouth, searching for the right words to acknowledge the truth, but nothing coherent formed. Instead, he felt something inside him collapse, a silent crumbling of the facade he had upheld for so long. Ashley, perhaps sensing how unsteady he had become, touched his arm lightly. "I'm not angry," she said, and there was an unexpected gentleness in her tone, a sincerity that surprised even Skyla. "We built a marriage on appearances. You gave me respect, comfort, stability. But never love. And I've known that for a long time." Her eyes lingered on his face, not reproachful, but almost relieved. "I think we both deserve something real, Ethan. Something honest." She paused, glancing once more at Skyla, who seemed torn between gratitude and dread. "You're free." Those words hung in the air with a weight he hadn't anticipated, not because they hurt, but because they were true. Ashley wasn't abandoning him, she was releasing him from a life neither of them could sustain without slowly eroding. It was a quiet, dignified goodbye delivered without drama or bitterness, a final acknowledgement of a marriage that had never become what it was meant to be. Ethan exhaled shakily, unsure whether he felt lighter or more burdened than before. He looked at Ashley with a mixture of guilt and gratitude, recognizing in her expression a strength he hadn't truly appreciated until this moment. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not out of obligation but from a genuine place inside him, one that had been dormant for years. "I know," she replied gently, stepping back. Her calmness was almost surreal, but it came from a clarity she had earned over years of watching him drift somewhere she could never reach. Then, with a final, simple nod, she turned and walked toward the entrance of the building, leaving behind a silence that felt like the first breath after a storm. She didn't look back, not because she didn't care, but because she had made peace with a truth she had carried alone for far too long. Skyla remained still, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling so subtly that only Ethan noticed. She didn't speak right away, too stunned by the grace and unexpected softness of what had just happened. She had imagined confrontation, anger, blame, never release. And certainly not kindness. Her gaze moved to the boys, who had resumed their game, blissfully unaware that their world had shifted in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Ethan stepped closer to Skyla, though not too close, reluctant to frighten her or give the impression that he expected anything from her. His voice was quiet, rough around the edges, layered with confusion, guilt, awe, and the beginnings of something he didn't yet have the courage to identify. "Skyla," he said, and for the first time in years, her name didn't taste like regret, only longing and truth. She lifted her eyes to his, bracing herself for whatever came next, not realizing that everything between them had already changed the moment he saw the twins. The space between them remained charged, fragile, uncertain, but no longer empty. For the first time in a very long time, the past and present stood face to face, and Ethan was forced to confront the reality he had unknowingly created. Skyla, still overwhelmed, didn't know what to say or what to feel. But the look in Ethan's eyes, unsteady, shaken, filled with a dawning sense of responsibility and something deeper, told her that nothing about this moment was going to disappear or be ignored. And as the boys laughed in the background, untouched by the gravity of the adults' emotions, Skyla realized that everything she had feared for 5 years had finally caught up to her, yet not in the destructive way she had imagined. Instead, it was unfolding in a mixture of vulnerability and unexpected grace, rewriting the future before any of them could fully process what it meant. Ethan stayed where he was for several moments after Ashley disappeared inside the building, feeling the weight of his life shifting in directions he had never prepared himself for. The sharp, clean lines of the world he had built suddenly felt blurred, softened by emotions he had tried to suppress for years. Skyla stood a few feet away, still frozen in a mixture of caution and disbelief, her hands clasped together as if bracing herself for an impact that hadn't yet come. She didn't know what Ethan intended, what he felt, what he would demand or deny. For 5 years she had been preparing for this moment to arrive in the worst possible form, imagining lawyers, or accusations or cold questions meant to unravel her carefully built life. Instead, she saw a man whose entire world had tilted beneath him, leaving him raw and unguarded in a way she had never seen before. He moved toward her slowly, as though approaching something fragile that might vanish if he made a wrong step. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words, regret, longing, confusion, and a quiet echo of something that had never truly died. He tried to speak but stopped twice before anything came out, his voice caught somewhere between apology and awe. When he finally managed words, they were barely above a whisper. Are Luca and Liam?" He couldn't even finish the question, as if the truth had already been carved too deeply into his understanding to need clarification. Skyla let out a shaky breath, her eyes flicking toward the boys before returning to Ethan with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Yes," she said quietly, determined not to waver even though her pulse felt like a drum in her ears. "They're yours." She expected shock or anger or some outburst of disbelief, but instead Ethan's expression shifted into something she couldn't interpret, something that softened his features and stripped away the distance he had carried for so long. She saw pain in his eyes, but not the kind rooted in resentment. It was the pain of realizing what he had lost, what he had missed, what he had unknowingly abandoned. He looked at the boys again, unable to tear his gaze away. They were crouched near a patch of grass, trying to rescue a ladybug that had landed on its back, their small hands careful and precise. He watched Liam whisper encouragement to the tiny creature and Luca grin proudly when it finally crawled onto his finger. They were gentle, kind, full of life. And they were his. The realization struck him again with almost physical force, leaving him breathless. He sank to one knee without even thinking, lowering himself to their level as though instinct guided him more strongly than reason ever had. When the boys looked up and saw him, they didn't react with fear or shyness. Luca approached first, curiosity overpowering hesitation, while Liam stood back slightly, observing with a more cautious but equally bright stare. Ethan studied their faces, every line, every angle, every hint of familiarity. Luca's grin was one he recognized from old childhood photos of himself. Liam's quiet, thoughtful gaze could have been a mirror of Ethan's own. He felt something in his chest tremble, a sensation that startled him with its intensity. "Hi," he said gently, his voice softer than Skyla had ever heard it. The boys exchanged a look, then Luca edged closer, his small fingers still carrying the remnants of grass and dirt. "Mom told us you were important," Luca announced with the straightforward honesty only a child could deliver. "She said you came from a different life." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected, each syllable a reminder of how much Skyla had protected them from his world, how carefully she had drawn a boundary that kept them safe. Liam finally stepped closer, though he kept one hand lightly resting on Skyla's leg, anchoring himself. He tilted his head, studying Ethan with a seriousness far beyond his age. "Why are your eyes like ours?" he asked, frowning a little, not in fear but in genuine curiosity. Skyla's breath caught, and she reached down to touch Liam's shoulder, ready to intervene, but Ethan shook his head gently, signaling that it was all right. He looked at Liam, and something warm and painful twisted inside him as he answered, "Because I'm your father." The boys didn't fully grasp the meaning at first, but a flicker of understanding crossed their faces, something instinctive, something that recognized connection even before logic could explain it. Luca smiled as though he had solved a puzzle that had been quietly tugging at him. Liam's eyes widened, and he pressed closer to Skyla, but not out of fear, more like he was trying to fit this new truth into the world he already knew. Skyla watched all of it unfold with her heart in her throat. She had imagined countless scenarios where the truth came out, but none of them resembled this quiet, tender moment where Ethan's voice trembled with sincerity, and the boys responded with wonder instead of fear. She felt her eyes sting, overwhelmed by relief and dread and the fragile hope she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. Ethan rose slowly, his movements almost reverent, and met Skyla's gaze with an expression she didn't know how to interpret. It was a blend of apology, wonder, longing, and something fierce that unsettled her with its intensity. He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the steadiness returning to him, the determination settling into his posture. "I want to be part of their lives," he said, his voice low and steady, though emotion trembled beneath it. "Not because I deserve it, not because I expect forgiveness, but because they're mine. And because I missed 5 years I can never get back." He hesitated before adding, "I don't want to lose any more." Skyla's breath caught again, this time for a different reason. She felt the ground shift beneath her, the future reshaping itself in ways she wasn't prepared for. She didn't trust him, not fully, not yet, but she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something real. Something honest. And it scared her almost as much as it comforted her. The boys called to her, pulling at the hem of her shirt, eager to show her the ladybug's triumphant escape. She knelt to listen to them, her hands trembling slightly, and when she looked up again, Ethan was still watching her with a quiet intensity that made her heart twist. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't a memory or a regret. He was present. Real. Standing in front of her with the weight of truth and the beginning of something unknown. And Skyla, though terrified of what might come next, understood that the world she had built was no longer just hers to navigate. It now belonged to the four of them, whether she was ready for it or not. In the days that followed their unexpected reunion, Skyla found herself living in a strange, delicate rhythm that felt both familiar and completely new. Ethan began appearing more frequently, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with a quiet persistence that unsettled her far more than any confrontation could have. He arrived early in the mornings to help carry the boys' backpacks, stayed late after their evening routines to listen to their endless stories, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, became a presence woven into the fabric of their daily life. Skyla had spent 5 years preparing herself to raise her sons alone, building walls of practicality and caution around her heart, yet each day Ethan chipped away at those walls simply by showing up with a sincerity she had never known from him before. At first, she kept her distance, observing him with a wary eye, waiting for the moment he might retreat back into the cold, calculated world he once chose over her. But he didn't retreat. Instead, he adjusted himself to the chaos she called a household, stepping over mismatched toys, learning how to braid comb-resistant hair on the morning Skyla was too exhausted to do it herself, and kneeling on the floor to build lopsided cardboard castles that the boys insisted were architectural masterpieces. The more he tried, the more Skyla felt that unpredictable tug in her chest, the one she had silenced for years. She didn't dare call it hope, but she could no longer deny that something was changing. The boys accepted him with an ease that surprised her. Children had no past to untangle, no grudges to nurture, they had only curiosity and instinct, and something about Ethan spoke to both. Luca gravitated toward him immediately, eager to impress him with tiny triumphs, from climbing the jungle gym at the park to demonstrating how high he could count without stumbling. Liam, slower to open up, watched Ethan for days with thoughtful eyes before finally inching closer during story time, eventually claiming the space against Ethan's arm as if it belonged to him. Skyla saw the way Ethan softened when the boys leaned into him, how he blinked rapidly sometimes when he thought no one noticed, overwhelmed by the weight of emotions he didn't yet know how to carry. One evening, after the boys had finally drifted into restless sleep, Skyla found Ethan in her small kitchen rinsing paintbrushes the boys had used for their afternoon craft. He was still wearing his tailored dress pants and expensive watch, yet his shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing smudges of blue and green paint along his forearms, as if he had spent the whole day submerged in their world. The blend of elegance and awkward domesticity made her chest tighten with a strange combination of amusement and tenderness. "You don't have to do that," she said quietly from the doorway, though she didn't move to stop him. Ethan glanced back at her, his expression softer than she expected, tired but peaceful in a way she had never witnessed when they were younger. "I want to," he replied, turning back to the sink. His voice carried a sincerity that both comforted and frightened her. "I missed everything. Every first word, every step, every laugh. I can't change that, but I can be here now." His words settled heavily in the room, pulling up emotions Skyla had buried deep enough she thought they would never surface again. She leaned against the doorframe, her fingers curling around its edge as she tried to steady her breathing. For years she had imagined confronting him, imagined screaming or crying or demanding he acknowledge their children. But standing here, seeing him like this, paint-stained, gentle, present, she realized the reality was far different than any painful fantasy she had conjured. Ethan dried his hands, turned, and leaned back against the counter, watching her with the kind of quiet focus that used to unravel her in seconds. He hesitated for a long moment before speaking. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said, his voice low and rough, "and I'm not asking for it. I made choices that hurt you, choices I regret in ways I can't explain. But I want." He paused, swallowing hard, searching for the right words. I want a chance to earn your trust again, and theirs. Not because I expect anything from you, but because I can't walk away. Not now. Not after seeing them. Not after seeing you." Skyla felt her breath catch, and she looked away, blinking rapidly. It was overwhelming, hearing him speak with such unfiltered vulnerability. Her instinct was to shield herself, to protect the fragile world she had built for her sons, but something inside her, something long dormant, felt itself stirring. She crossed her arms, not out of defiance, but to keep her hands from trembling. "You say that now," she murmured, her voice barely steady, "but you've never had to live with the consequences before. You don't know what it means to stay." Ethan stepped closer, slowly, as if afraid to startle her. "Then teach me," he said softly. "Show me. I'm not asking for a place in your life overnight. I'm asking for the chance to be consistent. To be worthy of them. And maybe, someday, of you." She should have rejected the notion immediately. She should have reminded him of the years she spent alone, the nights she cried silently so the boys wouldn't hear, the sacrifices he had never witnessed. But instead, she found herself staring into the eyes she once loved fiercely, eyes she had tried to forget and failed. There was no arrogance in his expression now, no trace of the man who once allowed fear and duty to dictate his choices. Instead, she saw a man stripped of illusions, humbled by truth, and for the first time, she believed he might actually mean what he said. The weeks that followed became a slow, fragile transformation. Ethan continued to show up in small, steady ways, attending school meetings, cooking simple breakfasts even when he burned half of them, patching a broken shelf at midnight because Luca insisted it was where his toy dragon slept. Skyla found herself watching him more often, trying to understand the shift inside him, trying to determine whether it was real or temporary. She fought her own emotions fiercely, unwilling to surrender to the possibility of something she wasn't sure she could survive losing a second time. One evening, as they walked home from the park, the boys raced ahead, laughing, leaving the two adults trailing behind. Skyla glanced at Ethan, intending to comment on the boys' energy, but the words caught in her throat when she saw him watching them with a look so full of tenderness that her heart flipped over itself. He noticed her gaze and met it with a small, vulnerable smile, as if uncertain whether he was allowed to be happy. She looked away quickly, but it was too late. Something inside her had already shifted. For the first time since their reunion, Skyla allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by fear or bitterness. A future where the boys had both parents present, where she wasn't alone in every difficult decision, where Ethan wasn't a ghost from a past she tried to bury but a man who stood beside her with unwavering determination. She wasn't ready to embrace it fully, not yet, but the possibility alone felt like a fragile seed taking root inside her. And as the boys ran ahead under the fading sunlight, their laughter echoing down the street, she realized that the life she had built and the life she had once dreamed of were slowly, cautiously, beginning to converge. Spring arrived softly, carrying with it the kind of warmth that loosened the tightness in Skyla's shoulders and made the boys restless with joy. The trees outside her apartment burst into pale green, and the days stretched enough to make evenings feel lighter. It was during this shift of seasons that Ethan suggested the four of them take a trip to the coast, nothing extravagant or formal, just a simple day where the boys could run freely and she wouldn't have to think about bills or routines or the fragile boundaries she and Ethan were still navigating. Skyla hesitated at first, uncertain whether she was ready to step into something that resembled a family outing, but there was a hopeful spark in Luca's eyes and an earnestness in Liam's that she couldn't deny. She finally nodded, and when she saw Ethan's relieved smile, something inside her loosened in a way she hadn't expected. The drive to the ocean was filled with the kind of noise that had once belonged only to Skyla and the boys, overlapping questions, poorly sung songs, and the constant rustling of the twins trading snacks back and forth. Ethan drove with surprising ease, adjusting the mirror every few minutes not to check traffic, but to watch the boys in the back seat as they pointed excitedly at passing scenery. Skyla sat beside him, quietly observing the way he softened around the edges when the boys laughed, as if their presence rewired something deep inside him. He didn't seem like the man she used to know, rigid, controlled, forever calculating the safe choice. This version of Ethan was present, engaged, unguarded, and she found herself learning him all over again. When they arrived at the beach, Luca and Liam bolted across the sand without a second thought, their laughter ringing through the open air. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, waves rolling in gentle, rhythmic pulses that soothed everything Skyla had been carrying for years. She watched her sons chase the shoreline, their blonde hair flashing in the sunlight like flecks of gold, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply breathe. Ethan stood beside her, hands in his pockets, not intruding on her thoughts, but quietly sharing the moment. After a few minutes, he walked forward and knelt beside the boys, helping them build uneven sandcastles that collapsed whenever the tide crept too close. The sight made Skyla's chest ache in a way that wasn't pain but something unexpectedly tender. Later, when the boys were busy collecting seashells, Skyla found herself walking alongside Ethan near the water, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand with each step. The breeze tangled her hair, and Ethan reached up instinctively to tuck a strand behind her ear before catching himself, withdrawing his hand with a shy, almost embarrassed smile. Skyla felt her heart give a small, involuntary flutter at the gesture, the memory of an old intimacy brushing against her like an echo. "You're different," she said quietly, not accusingly but with gentle curiosity. "Not the man I remember." Ethan took a slow breath, watching the waves break and disappear along the shore. "I spent years building a life I thought I was supposed to live," he said, his voice steady but thoughtful. "But it wasn't a life at all. It was a performance. And when I saw the boys, when I saw you again, everything shifted. Suddenly I knew what mattered and what didn't." He glanced at her, his expression open and earnest. "I don't want to pretend anymore. Not with them. Not with you. Not with myself." Skyla felt the weight of his words, the sincerity woven into each one. She looked ahead, watching Luca hold up a shell triumphantly while Liam examined it with scientific seriousness, and her chest tightened with an emotion she had been resisting for months. "It's not easy for me to trust you," she admitted softly. "You hurt me in a way that changed everything. I had to learn to live without you. To raise them without you. And I don't know how to let you back in without feeling like I'm risking everything I fought so hard to build." Ethan nodded, his expression touching on sadness but not surprise. "You don't need to decide anything now," he said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness overnight. I'm not even asking for us. I'm asking for the chance to show you, and them, who I can be. Who I should have been all along." The honesty in his voice disarmed her. She turned toward him fully, searching his face for any sign of the old hesitation or the carefully guarded detachment he used to hide behind. But she found none. What she saw instead was a man stripped of the weight of expectations, standing vulnerable and hopeful before her, ready to step into a life he had once been too afraid to choose. The boys called out to them then, waving their arms excitedly and urging them to come see a small tide pool they had discovered. Skyla laughed softly, and Ethan's eyes flickered with warmth at the sound. They walked together toward the boys, and something subtle but unmistakable settled between them, not certainty, not a declaration, but the quiet awakening of possibility. As the sun dipped lower, casting the shoreline in shades of gold and rose, Skyla watched Ethan lift each boy into his arms, spinning them gently until they shrieked with joy. The sight etched itself into her memory with painful sweetness, a glimpse into a future she hadn't dared imagine. She stood there, the ocean wind brushing against her skin, and felt the boundaries she had built around her heart waver. She realized then, with a clarity that startled her, that nothing was lost forever. The years she spent alone, the nights filled with fear and exhaustion, the sacrifices she made, they were part of her story, but they did not have to define the ending. Healing did not erase the past, it rewrote its place in the future. And as she watched Ethan hold their sons with a tenderness that reshaped him entirely, she felt something inside her settle into a quiet, fragile hope. Later, when they walked back to the car, Luca holding her hand and Liam holding Ethan's, Skyla felt the four of them form something she couldn't yet name, something imperfect but real. She didn't know where their path would lead or how long it would take to rebuild what had been broken, but for the first time in 5 years, she wasn't afraid of the future. Not with Ethan walking beside her. Not with the boys laughing between them. And as the last light of the day shimmered across the waves, she understood that happiness did not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it returned slowly, gently, stitching itself back into a life one fragile moment at a time.